Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Caribbean Climate Smart Accelerator's post COP29 press conference. We are delighted to have you with us today. My name is Tiffany Bryan, and I am the Chief of Staff at the Caribbean Climate Smart Accelerator. And we are joined today by two distinguished leaders, Cheryl Senhouse, the CCSA's Finance Innovation Director, as well as Raquel Moses, the UNFCCC Global SIDS Ambassador, as well as the CEO of the Climate Smart Accelerator. Please feel free to introduce yourselves in the chat and include your website and social media links. Please share any questions that you may have in the Q&A section so that we can be sure to have them answered for you today. And we would love to stay connected with you, so you will see our information and contact details shared with you throughout this session. Today, we will be discussing the key outcomes from COP29. We will begin with opening remarks from Cheryl Senhouse, followed by Raquel Moses. After their presentations, we will open the floor to your questions. So without further ado, I'll now hand over to Cheryl Senhouse. Cheryl, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Tiffany, and thank you to everyone who's joined us this morning as we review the outcomes of COP29 from a global perspective, as well as from the perspective of our Caribbean nations. As we convene today, we stand at a pivotal moment in the global struggle against climate change. COP29 has brought us some promising advancements, but the journey ahead remains challenging. This year, a historic $300 billion annual funding pledge was made, aiming to reach that figure by 2035. While this marks a positive step, it underscores the immense gap between pledges and the $1.3 trillion that experts believe is necessary to keep global warming below 1.5 degrees Celsius. We've seen progress in the operationalization of the Loss and Damage Fund, which offers financial support to countries hit hardest by climate change. However, questions linger about its full implementation and whether it will meet the ever-growing needs of vulnerable nations. Similarly, the new collective quantified goal on climate finance raised important discussions, but the question remains, how do we ensure that these funds translate into real-world impact, and who will hold the responsibility for their effective use? Another positive development was the finalization of the carbon market framework, a critical achievement after nearly a decade of negotiations. This framework makes both international trading between nations and the carbon crediting mechanism fully operational, signaling a significant move towards global climate action. However, while there has been notable progress in addressing mitigation and adaptation measures, we must acknowledge that the clock is ticking. Are we moving fast enough to prevent the most catastrophic effects of climate change? The urgency remains clear, and in today's discussion, we'll evaluate the outcomes of these negotiations, assess the progress made, and identify the critical actions needed to build a sustainable future for all. On the key negotiation outcomes, specifically the status of the Loss and Damage Fund. While the operationalization of the Loss and Damage Fund is a significant achievement, it's crucial to recognize that much work remains. The fund now has a framework to channel resources to vulnerable nations, and its governance structure promises transparency and accountability. This is a vital step forward in ensuring that the countries most affected by climate change can access financial support to adapt and recover. Nonetheless, the pledges made so far fall short of what is needed. Experts estimate that the financial needs of the most affected nations could be in the hundreds of billions annually. The commitments we have today are just the beginning. There's an urgent need to scale up contributions to meet these escalating demands. For the nations already facing rising seas, extreme storms, and droughts, the risk is not hypothetical. It's a lived reality, and every day that passes without adequate funding exacerbates suffering. We must prioritize swift, accessible funding that addresses both immediate and long-term needs. The operationalization of the Loss and Damage Fund is a crucial step, but it's only the first. We need to build on this momentum and ensure the fund's success through equitable and efficient distribution of resources. Turning to the new collective quantified goal of climate finance, we saw incremental but essential progress in defining a global climate finance target to help developing nations transition to low carbon economies. The focus has shifted towards surpassing the original 100 billion annual commitment. And while this is an important milestone, it is abundantly clear that the needs far exceed this figure. The commitment to achieve a goal of 300 billion per year by 2035 is encouraging, but we must address the glaring gaps in financial support, particularly in terms of fairness and urgency. The financial divide between developed and developing nations continues to be a major point of contention. Developed nations have pledged substantial funds, but the question remains, will these funds be distributed equitably and in a timely manner? Countries like ours in the Caribbean are already on the front lines of the climate crisis, with rising sea levels and extreme weather events. And we've long demanded adaptation finance, and it is essential that it becomes a priority within the national collective quantified goal. If we're serious about limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees, these financial commitments must go beyond the baseline targets, and they must be based on a shared sense of responsibility. The path to climate justice depends on equitable and immediate action. On Article 6, carbon markets, COP29 also saw notable progress in refining country-to-country carbon trading under this article of the Paris Agreement. The finalization of the framework for carbon markets offers a transparent and accountable structure for carbon credit trading. This is an important milestone, especially for developing nations, as it opens new financial avenues to support climate projects. The Paris Agreement crediting mechanism provides robust environmental and human rights safeguards, including the requirement for explicit informed consent from indigenous communities before projects can proceed. This ensures that these initiatives respect local rights and needs, providing a more just and equitable approach to climate finance. However, the work here is far from over. The supervisory body tasked with overseeing the implementation of this new carbon crediting mechanism faces a long to-do list extending through 2025. The challenge will be to ensure that the principles of fairness and environmental integrity are upheld as the system becomes operational. Turning to mitigation and adaptation efforts, we see both promise and glaring shortcomings. Several countries have updated their nationally determined contributions, committing to more ambitious emissions reductions. Yet the reality is that the collective global action remains insufficient to meet the 1.5 degrees Celsius target. The gap between current pledges and the actions required to avert the worst impacts of climate change remain vast, and the window for meaningful action is closing rapidly. On adaptation, while there's increasing recognition of the need for scaled-up finance to help vulnerable nations cope with the existing impacts of climate change, commitments have yet to match the scale needed. The Caribbean and other affected regions continue to call for urgent, adequate funding to help them adapt to the inevitable changes they face. We must remember that adaptation finance is not a luxury. It is a necessity for the survival of our nations already grappling with the effects of climate change. To conclude, while it is clear that we've made progress at COP29, we are far from where we need to be. The establishment of the Loss and Damage Fund, the establishment of the National Collective Quantified Goal, and the advancement of carbon markets are all steps in the right direction. Yet these steps must be followed by swift, concrete action. The financial commitments made so far are insufficient to meet the scale of the challenge, and the urgency of the climate crisis has never been clearer. For small island nations and vulnerable communities, the impacts of climate change are not a distant threat. They are happening right now. And it is incumbent upon us to honor the promises made and ensure that the funds pledged are distributed fairly and swiftly. COP29, however, has brought us closer to solutions, but the real work begins now. Let's move forward with renewed commitment to equity, urgency, and a shared responsibility to build a climate resilient future for all. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Cheryl, for those insightful remarks. We now turn to Raquel Moses, the CEO of the CCSA and the UNFCCC Global SIDS Ambassador. Raquel, over to you.
Thank you so much, Tiffany. As you can imagine, these are incredibly precarious times for all of us, the region and the planet. Today, I'll be sharing with you some of the outcomes of COP and what we believe they mean for the planet, for our region, and certainly from our perspective and the work that we do at CCSA. Today, I'll cover our objectives, the outcomes, our engagement, and the road to COP30. Notwithstanding anything that we share today, which at times may suggest frustration with the progress and the process and the progress that we've made to date, we are incredibly proud of our COP collaborators. They include the Caribbean Community Climate Change Center, 5Cs, Caribbean Development Bank, Climate Analytics, the Organization of Eastern Caribbean States, OECS, CAF, the Development Bank of Latin America and the Caribbean Catastrophe Risk Insurance Facility, the Cropper Foundation, and NGC Green. And of course, we can't forget our negotiators, who we believe have done everything conceivable in order to extract the best outcomes for the Global South, all small island developing states, and the Caribbean. Where we'll start and end is to say this: climate action is bigger than any one economy, any one country, and any one leader. It will be achieved by people who care about other people, and in some instances, people who will feel before they hear the calls for action. Any hesitation that we have about the outcomes of COP, we know and acknowledge that there are pockets of resolve with non-state actors in the private sector, at the local government level, and within non-governmental organizations. We are not part of the negotiation. Instead, we're part of many non-state actors that collaborate on the sidelines in advocating and pushing forward specific objectives that we have highlighted today. Our objectives for COP29 were that we wanted to promote our Climate Smart Map, raising awareness and encouraging the adoption of that Climate Smart Map that you can find at map.caribbeanaccelerator.org. It's a tool designed to provide information and insights for climate adaptation and sustainable development in our region. To highlight and promote our innovation fund, which is aimed at cutting-edge entrepreneurial solutions in the areas of ocean economy, food security, and circular economy that drive climate action and climate income. And of course, advocating for further operationalization of the Loss and Damage Fund. Here are some highlights from the negotiation. In an effort to close the global gap on adaptation finance, they established the Baku Adaptation Roadmap, the objective of which is to report on the second global stocktake, which is due by 2028. This will include adaptation indicators, metrics, and methodologies to be developed for better measurement of the progress we're making towards adaptation. A sidebar note is that the global stocktake occurred last year, and it's important to note that the outcomes of that stocktake included recommendations to get us back on track. These include tripling renewable energy capacity, doubling energy efficiency, and transitioning away from fossil fuels. It also calls for the halt of deforestation and transitioning to more circular economy approaches. According to UNFCCC, the next set of updates on nationally determined contributions are due in 2025 in February, and most of our countries in our region have submitted the required 2 NDCs coming out of the Paris Agreement and the update due in 2020, with the following exceptions: Trinidad and Tobago, St. Vincent and the Grenadines, and Guyana. But bear in mind that across the 29 territories that we represent, 10 of them are overseas territories. This means that they don't submit NDCs, but their contributions are reflected in their parent states' NDCs, which in most instances cannot be disaggregated and are sometimes unclear. It means that they lack a specific voice in global climate negotiations. Cheryl would have covered the NCQG and where we landed there. The goal of mobilizing 100 billion per year in climate finance was established during COP15 in Denmark, and that expires next year. So this is progress as it refers to tripling that requirement. However, as Cheryl would have pointed out, it falls well short of what is necessary. For the 17 territories that we cover that will produce NDCs that are due in 2025, it's important that they cost the elements required, even if those are estimated costs, since our advocacy requires that we have clarity on our needs as a region. A tool that we developed in collaboration with the Islands Resiliency Action Challenge is a resilience scorecard, and it was used by Dominica to assess their resilience cost gap. It's something that we can offer countries through this process. It also suggests that a significant increase in public resources should be provided through what are designated as the operating entities of the financial mechanism, including entities like the Green Climate Fund and the Global Environment Facility, as well as the Adaptation Fund, the Least Developed Countries Fund, and the Special Climate Change Fund. It is suggesting that those entities at least triple annual outflows from those funds from 2022 levels by 2030. These entities are at the very least a challenge to access, and given the resourcing required, we encourage regional entities with several years of dedicated resources to commit to becoming accredited that they do so. But additionally, we should maximize the potential of the accredited entities already in our region. And those include the Caribbean Community Climate Change Center, 5Cs, the Caribbean Development Bank, the CARICOM Development Fund, the Central American Bank for Economic Integration, CABE, CAF, the Development Bank of Latin America and the Caribbean, the Development Bank of Jamaica Limited, IDB Invest, the Inter-American Development Bank, and the Jamaica Social Investment Fund. It also encourages developing countries to make contributions through South-South cooperation on a voluntary basis, which is a bit, if we're being frank, of a double-edged sword. While we do need more South-South cooperation, that should be exclusively on the basis of investment, as the source of grant funding should come from the wealth created by the carbon in the atmosphere, which is housed in the global north. The gaps are that it still lacks specificity about the sources of financing. It also lacks specificity about loans versus grants. Additionally, it is rumored that China was willing to agree to a goal of 500 billion, which would have come at least close to half of what was needed, but it didn't receive sufficient support by other wealthy nations. What this means and what we can learn is that there's an opportunity to engage China to explore additional opportunities. Our region will be clamoring for climate finance in an increasingly competitive global environment. The release on the NCQG speaks to efficiency, so expanding rather than creating new programs, which are key opportunities for us. As we think about how to scale up climate finance, we have to be pragmatic as well as practical. So we need to consider the resources that we already have across the region, including CDB, IDB, CAF, and other financial institutions that are being founded. What the release also speaks to, which I can't underscore enough, are locally led approaches. Far too long, solutions have been delivered for us by others. Not only do we in our region best understand our own needs and transition requirements, but the capacity we build in delivering those approaches must be ours to keep. I encourage all recipient organizations to ensure that the approaches we pursue are locally led and beneficial to us and our lived experience. We should also ensure that our approaches are equitable, just, and inclusive in their execution. Cheryl would have mentioned the International Carbon Market Standards, which they agreed just prior to COP. And these are standards that will help us to assess projects on carbon removal. These are great projects that will help us to establish that the baseline is below business as usual, contribute to the equitable sharing of mitigation benefits between participating countries, and that they align well with the NDCs that have been developed. It also speaks significantly to the use of technology in the monitoring and the assessment of these solutions using data, and there's a requirement that these solutions be additional, which we all agree with. But as we look at these kinds of mechanisms, far too few of the entities able to assess and certify carbon credits are located in the global south. We must work to build internal capacity to decrease our reliance on external sources for the assessments and consultancies required to access these opportunities for funding. Previous carbon market transactions that were inequitable have undermined this marketplace. This development to establish a strong global standards seeks to rectify that, but will only do so if the inequity previously baked into the process is eliminated. At CCSA, we host and participate in investor forums on an ongoing basis, and we encourage any entrepreneurs with working solutions to remove carbon from the atmosphere to contact us via our website, CaribbeanAccelerator.org, and submit their projects for consideration for matchmaking with investors. There was also some progress on transparency and climate reporting. There were over 42 events on the Together for Transparency initiative, and that helps to prepare nationally determined contributions and execute them with integrity to ensure that there is clarity. From our region, only Guyana has submitted their first biennial transparency report, which is due by the end of 2024. We hope the others follow. This underscores the importance of capacity building to ensure that other Caribbean countries can meet their reporting commitments, enabling better access to climate finance and a clearer demonstration of our region's needs. A decision was also taken to extend the program of high-level champions to 2030. The champions produce critical leadership on the work of non-state actors. We work quite closely with the climate champions, and I was appointed a UNFCCC Global Ambassador for the Race to Zero and the Race to Resilience under this program. We view this development as a positive step, recognizing the necessity of non-state actors in implementing the ambitious plans of the Paris Agreement. Our association with the high-level champions provides us with unparalleled levels of access at the international level. For this, we are very, very grateful, and we look forward to continuing to work with them and amplifying the voices and actions of non-state actors. One of our key advocacy efforts was on the operationalization of the Loss and Damage Fund, which was established, as we know, to assist vulnerable nations in addressing the damage that we face. It was well noted that they have now signed the trustee agreement with the Philippines, who have enabled the fund to commence in 2025. And Sweden also pledged an additional 20 million, bringing the total commitments to 720 million. We also commend the selection of Ibrahima Shike Diong of Senegal as the inaugural executive director of the fund, which is a significant step in ensuring that leadership from the Global South is reflected in its operation. In our region alone, with 54% of territories reporting, we estimate that the need for loss and damage funding exceeds 17 billion. That's from the data on our climate smart map. And even that figure may be underreported. Globally, the estimated need ranges from 1.7 trillion to 3.1 trillion by 2050. This is stark contrast between the current need and the commitments that have been made. It requires a great deal of creativity and resourcefulness to meet the fund's objectives. What this means for us in the Caribbean is that we must prioritize minimizing loss and damage, as current funding commitments are far from adequate to address the challenges that we face. We call on the regional and global insurance industry, those with the most to gain from improving our resilience, to become more engaged partners, building resilience not only to secure their future, but the future for all of us. At COP29, we participated in a number of events, including Adaptation and Investing in Climate Resilience, a fireside chat hosted by Tom Mitchell of the International Institute of Environmental Development, alongside Avinash Prasad of IDB. We participated on a panel on climate finance moderated by Carlos Garcia. We participated in a plenary where the Marrakesh Partnership event on finance action took place, and an IRENA event on public-private partnership for SIDS transitions. We also hosted a Commonwealth fireside chat with young activists on gender-responsive national climate funds, and participated in an intergenerational climate circle where we collaborated with young activists to provide support opportunities for future initiatives. I also participated in a panel with the governor of Para where COP30 will be held, as well as executives from Nestle and PepsiCo on how we're preparing for COP30, the climate finance needs that we'll need to unlock, and the role of the private sector. I also hosted a fireside chat with the Princess of Jordan and the climate champion for COP29. We also hosted a networking event to engage with donors and collaborators in a Caribbean setting that we established in Azerbaijan. What's next as we prepare for COP30, which will be hosted in our region? We have an unparalleled opportunity to showcase the Caribbean as a leader in delivering climate solutions. Our priorities will focus on, as always, attracting new sources of funding to our region, demonstrating excellence in implementing climate solutions, and advocating for climate justice on behalf of small island states. Let me reiterate, climate action is bigger than any one economy, any one country, or any one leader. It will be achieved by people who care about other people. Collaboration and innovation and commitment will guide us toward a sustainable and equitable future for the Caribbean and beyond. The challenges may be great, but so is our determination to overcome them. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Raquel, for such a powerful statement. And thank you, Cheryl, again for your impact statement as well. We now open the floor to questions. And I just want to remind everyone that if you have questions, please feel free to type them in the Q&A section of this chat. Opening up the floor to the questions, the first question is, given the disappointing commitments made at COP29, how do you evaluate the implications for resilience and climate strategies of small island developing states moving forward, Raquel?
You know, I think we have to be sober about what it means, and that we will be doing this in a very competitive environment. I look at it in two ways. We made progress, and it could have been possible that we didn't make any progress. So while disappointing when you're going in for 1 trillion and you leave with 300 billion, the fact remains that progress is progress. I think the devil is in the details, and we need to make sure that we are advocating on our own behalf and that we are taking advantage of those opportunities as they present themselves so that we are first to the table with our asks and needs, and we are mobilizing the climate finance that is already on the table. And if we're being completely fair and honest, we are not maximizing our access to the climate finance that we have. So let's focus on the things that we can do and we can do well, and position ourselves to make the best out of this less than ideal situation.
Thank you so much, Raquel, for that answer. And thank you, Kevin Brown, for the question. And still on Kevin's amazing question, Cheryl, what specific advocacy strategies will the CCSA employ to address unmet needs of the SIDS in light of the inadequate climate finance commitments made at COP29?
Thank you, Tiffany. I think from our perspective as a CCSA, recognizing that our role in supporting our coalition countries as well as partners across the Caribbean is really focused on leveraging information and data to support decision making. I think one of our two key advocacy strategies I'd want to highlight would be our Climate Smart Map tool. Quantification of the issue, I think, is an important first step in understanding where we need to go next, what the solutions could be, and who can participate in providing those solutions. Our Climate Smart Map aggregates data on risk, losses, solutions, demographic information, economic indicators that all help to form a picture of where we are as a region compared to the the global goal or needs that have been set out and help us understand where we need to go and what the key subsectors and sectors that we need to focus in on, what those are for the Caribbean region. So I think that tool for us is an important part of the toolkit, pardon me, in helping the Caribbean nation address the gaps that we see. The second part of the strategy I want to highlight is building on that, identifying other partners beyond the governments and multilaterals, namely the private sector, who we all recognize has a significant role to play in filling the funding gap on climate action, as well as supporting the achievement of sustainability in commerce and our market activities to be able to address the challenges of climate action. So enabling engagement with the private sector, bringing them to the table, encouraging partnership with the public sector, with entrepreneurs, supporting the direction of finance that is available through their philanthropies to support climate action, as well as helping them achieve their own sustainability goals through partnerships, research, development of solutions, ensuring the embedding of robust sustainability and climate goals within their business models, I think is an important step and is a crucial role that we as an organization play to support the advocacy for our Caribbean nations. So those are the main things I'd want to highlight on that.
Thank you so much, Cheryl, for that answer. Movement to establish a global architecture for the market. There are some officials that in Guyana that believe that the agreement does not live up to the goal of keeping on track for the sustainable future. And what are your thoughts, Raquel?
That is such a great question, Naomi. So we required this global architecture to establish the market. And as we experienced, right, global carbon markets had been undermined for some time. I think that there are a couple of things that we need to do to keep that goal on track. I think certainly it can't be that all or most of the entities that are assessing carbon credits are located in the global north, where they're also producing the carbon. It just can't be that there is inequity in that process, because it means that we are paying people to assess carbon that they have produced versus rewarding ourselves for sequestering that carbon or addressing that carbon. We also need to look at things like equity. Now, it speaks lightly to how do we address the justice in the process, but I don't think that it necessarily indicates very clearly about, fair pricing, and people will tell you fair pricing goes hand in hand with the quality of the credits. As much as that is also true, what is true is that the nations that don't have the negotiation power are often served a bit of a raw deal as it relates to the carbon credits. I applaud the progress that has been made on establishing these standards, both for how credits will be assessed as well as for carbon removal. Once again, I would advocate for us looking at the opportunities that exist. Let us work together to create an entity in the global south, funded by the global north, to build our capacity in assessing these carbon credits and ensuring that there is fairness in how they are determined, and that there's increasing rigor, but that rigor is not overly onerous so that it makes it more difficult for us to sell our carbon credits. On carbon removals, I really want to see some new solutions coming out of our region so that we can, again, capitalize on that income for carbon removal.
Thank you so much, Raquel. And then I would like to just double down on that amazing answer that you've given, as Naomi has also asked that there have been concerns that more safeguards need to be in place to prevent low quality carbon credits from entering the market. And I would love to hear your thoughts on that. And additionally, given the outcomes of this year, can you share what can be expected to prepare for further discussions and to take more proactive actions in the next year?
We have to be vigilant. We have to be vigilant on the safeguards that are required to ensure that the carbon credits that are entering the market are quality credits. But it's so important that, and they speak to the issue of additionality, right? You have to prove through data the additionality of the credits that you are entering into this marketplace. And so from that standpoint, I think that is a safeguard. We want to ensure that there are quality credits entering the marketplace. But we also need to be advocates and not on the sideline of this market. So we need to be looking at the carbon exchanges, and not just because these credits aren't being sold into our markets, we're not paying attention to what's happening globally. Because when you see people in, Africa selling credits for $7, and the same, similar credits are being sold in the US for upwards of $100 or more, that's just fundamentally unfair. So we have to continue to watch this process and be a part of how it's negotiated and how this whole system comes into place for us to monitor and use the data and prove the additionality and ensure that there is reliability in how these carbon credits are assessed and how they're judged. And at least now we have a global standard that everybody will be working towards.
Thank you so much, Raquel. Now, Cheryl, in light of the COP29 outcomes, what innovative financing mechanisms do you believe are critical for enhancing the climate resilience of small island developing states?
I think a very broad question. I think we could discuss this one for the entire day, but I won't do that. I'll limit my comments to a couple of key points. What happens at the level of the country or the sovereign to address climate change? We're seeing a lot of innovation at that level. Certainly, the top of mind would be the use of innovative sovereign financing strategies to address debt sustainability in the form of debt swaps coupled with blue, green, climate resilient bonds. Several definitions attached to the instruments that we're seeing emerging. But I think those types of instruments really going forward are becoming critical to help our small island developing states to address the dual challenges of debt-strapped economies with raising finance for climate change and to address resilience. Coupled with that, we're seeing in those instruments the embedding of targets and goals that we can be rewarded for with lower interest rates if we achieve those goals. It embeds some incentive to perform, which I think is important to avoid greenwashing at the level of countries as well, but provides transparency and accountability as well at the level of the country to be able to ensure that the funds are channeled to the outcomes that were intended. So I think for us within the Caribbean region, this development is really a good one. We'd want to see that trickle down a bit more into the private capital markets. We have seen green bonds, for instance, trading on some of our exchanges. We've seen some private equity, some private players raising capital through sustainability instruments. And we definitely would want to see more of that being developed at the level of the private sector to sustain and to finance their own initiatives, but also to stimulate overall the investor appetite in impact investing and aligning the behaviors and actions of our entities with outcomes that provide good social outcomes. So there's that to start with. I think we also have a role to play in educating and advocating for the use of those instruments to advocate and support the continued calls for reform of the multilateral finance system. we have seen some progress towards that, but I think having the voices of vulnerable nations heard more consistently and lending more voices to the call for reforms that would generate financial instruments that really address the challenges that we face without exacerbating the inherent economic challenges of developing states, I think really is important. We, I think, continue to see some progress at the level of established entities. We've seen some changes as well at the level, for instance, of the Green Climate Fund in terms of the reduction in the bureaucracy that is involved in accessing funding from that agency and their key finance and deployment agency for climate action. So we want to see and support continued advocacy for those reforms. Those reforms are going to be critical to unlocking finance for our states and finance that can be put towards enriching the lives of our people and building resilience so that we're able to withstand the challenges of climate change. I think those are the key points I'd want to highlight in terms of financial innovation.
Thank you so much, Cheryl. And you're absolutely correct that that is such a broad topic, and we could speak about that for the entire day. But Raquel, I would love to know, how does the CCSA plan to address concerns regarding allocating climate finance, specifically towards adaptation and resilience projects for small island developing states? Raquel, you're on mute.
Yes. Great question, Kevin. What we know is this: there is a lot of climate finance available in specific areas. So we advocate a lot for specificity around what is required and where it can go. There is a lot of climate finance available for mitigation, and that produces natural cash flows. So it's easy to get that supported. But of course, as you're pointing out, how are we going to address the issue of adaptation? And that is more about us looking at what are the options. So the new carbon markets are an option. Natural assets haven't taken off as an opportunity for investment, and we haven't lost hope in that yet. And of course, food sustainability projects also produce an opportunity to help us to incorporate adaptation measures and get those projects funded. And so while we don't have very many opportunities to allocate climate finance specifically towards adaptation, what we do need to do is to be really creative. So it means that things like on our innovation fund, and how do we find more adaptation solutions that might have the potential to generate revenue. So things like mangrove rehabilitation and using that as a combination of tourism, mitigation, selling the credits, as well as adaptation in preventing storm surge. So what are the elements of low-hanging fruit that we can tap into? Also looking at things like blended finance and how does that play a role? Is philanthropy willing to get involved in creating instruments that can allow us to unlock private capital for things like, coral rehabilitation that then prevents storm surge and protects assets on the coastline? And are hotels willing to pay for something like that to support making those kinds of solutions more readily available? So we're seeing some creativity. And what it means is that we have to highlight those solutions so that as they come up and they become available, that we are specific about using the kind of finance that can only be used in those instances and making sure that they are ring-fenced for it. While we see a lot of mitigation projects advocating for grants, and they do require grants in the preparation phase, but once they get to the point of being de-risked, grant funding should not be used for that at all. We definitely need to steer grant funding towards adaptation because there is such a greater need and it is so much more difficult to fund.
Thank you so much for that answer, Raquel. And based on that amazing answer that you've given, I would love for you to elaborate, or I should say Kevin, because he has many questions. Thank you so much, Kevin. He would love for you to elaborate on how the CCSA intends on facilitating public-private partnerships that you just mentioned to unlock additional funding for climate initiatives targeted towards SIDS.
Once again, Kevin, great question. And I mean, that's what we do all day, every day. We are facilitating public-private partnerships. We are engaging the private sector and coming together with public sector objectives and bringing those connections together. And in terms of our KPIs, that is our highest performing KPI, is making those public-private connections and bringing people to the table to have those collaborations, to make sure that where private sector is willing and able to get involved, that we are doing that. We do that through our investor forum. We do that on an ad hoc basis. We do that through the events that we host. We do that through the main things that we implement. So a major part of COP is facilitating those connections. When we participate in Climate Week, we're facilitating those connections. And when you see us out on social media, it is to develop those relationships so that we can facilitate those connections. And of course, it is the basis as well of our Climate Smart Map, ensuring that we provide the data that we believe the private sector and investors want, so that we can once again create those public-private connections.
Thank you so much, Raquel. Cheryl, based on Kevin's question, I'd love to hear from you in terms of what strategies you envision the CCSA will employ to enhance engagement with financial institutions to ensure that SIDS receive the necessary support to effectively implement their climate action plans.
So from the perspective of engagement with financial institutions, I think this approach in recognizing the need for having on board our partners who are able to deploy private capital, recognizing that has been deeply embedded in our operational and strategic approach as an organization. One of the key initiatives that I lead as the Finance Innovation Director is our Financial Advisory Committee, which is a grouping of CEOs from financial institutions, mainly banks from across the region, who, as organizations, are committed to leveraging their capital base to support the achievement of climate action and the achievement of resilience for the countries and markets in which they operate. We certainly recognize that when our countries are under threat, physically, socially, and economically, it does have trickle-down effects for our private sector and for our financial markets. And as a result, we want to kind of leverage that recognition there and their commitment as an organization to provide them with access to projects that may suit their particular risk appetites, for early investment and for support, both from the public side, but also from the commercial side, in terms of providing capital to entrepreneurs who are operating in sectors or subsectors that are focused on climate action and resilience. We have also been invited, or CEO is a representative on the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero's Net Zero, their Latin American network chapter. And through our representation on that body, we have been advocating for the establishment of a Caribbean subchapter for GFANS, as it is called with an abbreviation. And we want to, through that effort, once again, bring together financial institutions who are focused on supporting the achievement of net zero for our region and for decarbonizing their portfolios, to provide them with a forum to plan the transition for their entities and to hone in on strategies and frameworks for the Caribbean that will enable us to achieve greening of our portfolios across the financial sector. There are also opportunities for the development of subsectors, subchapters for GFANS, that they also have representative chapters for insurance companies, for asset managers, for quite a few of the players across the financial sector. So there are opportunities to leverage global insight, to embed best practices, and to craft those that best suit the Caribbean region, to support a transition of our financial sector as well towards climate action. I think any attempt and any efforts and outcomes from those activities certainly will lead down to the benefit of our states, both at the level of the financing of countries as well as at the level of financing our entrepreneurs or small businesses and even our large businesses. We also want to recognize that we would have seen at the level of the Barbados Debt for Nature swap, the leadership and participation of a local financial institution, say BC, while they are a subsidiary of a Canadian bank, certainly the local arm, the Barbados market arm of that subsidiary would have been a key player in the execution of that transaction for the first time, in the execution of those transactions within the region. We certainly would want to acknowledge that now means that there is the transfer and embedding of knowledge that is going to be critical for moving our market forward in adopting innovative financial mechanisms to support the transition and recognizing the importance of that at the level of the financial institutions. What we hope to see is the going forward is the participation of Indigenous financial institutions and perhaps the extension to our credit unions and other players within the financial market in the transactions at the government level or perhaps larger transactions at the private market level that are going to support climate action across the region.
Thank you so much, Cheryl, for that answer. Raquel, just very succinctly, Naomi has a follow-up question for you, and I'd love if you could just very briefly answer her and let her know, because her question is that you mentioned engaging with China when you were giving your response on carbon credits, and she'd love for you to just expound on that just a little.
Right. So I was talking about the NCQG and the negotiation, and that the Guardian reported that China was willing to agree to 500 billion a year, and the other sort of wealthy nations did not want to support them in that 500 billion, which would have gotten us a lot closer. And so, we can engage China. Our needs aren't as expensive as the rest of the globe. So if we know that they are willing to provide more climate finance, let's make use of that. But let's also first utilize the climate finance that we have available in our region and look to China in those areas where we think they will bring strategic advantage on climate finance, because we know that they are willing to provide more climate finance than was agreed globally.
Thank you so much for that answer, Raquel. And thank you again to both you and Cheryl and everyone who joined us today. We appreciate your time and the valuable insights that you've provided. And at this time, Raquel, I would love to just open the floor to any final thoughts that you'd like to share before we close out today.
This is something that we all have to be committed to and engaged in and really dedicated to see through. This may not have been the ideal response coming out of COP, but I think Simon Steele said it best. Nobody got what they wanted coming out of COP. And we have to realize that this is just going to be an ongoing challenge, and it's going to be a fight, but it is the fight worth fighting. So this next COP is going to be a completely different ball game. It is going to be one that is housed in our region, and the work towards COP30 and producing results for COP30 starts today. And we're all in this together. So we need to just keep asking the great questions and executing from our own vantage points to ensure that we see the results, and we can't ever say that we left something on the table because, we just weren't committed enough. Let us commit ourselves to this process and making progress every single day.
Thank you so much for that, Raquel. And thank you again to everyone who joined us today. We appreciate your time. And at this time, I really want to tell everyone that, we hope you have a great day and thank you for being a part of this important conversation. I just want to take the time to remind you all that packages, which include the recording of this session, will be distributed to all invited members of the press. Thank you again so much for joining us. And with that, I bid you all goodbye.
Thanks,
you.
Tiffany. And thanks,
Thank
Sharon.
you.